The shattering of crystal echoed through the hushed elite dining room, but it was the billionaire's freezing voice that truly stopped time. "You are nothing but an incompetent, pathetic excuse for a man," she sneered, wiping expensive wine from her designer coat while demanding his immediate termination. The single father stood paralyzed, his livelihood destroyed in seconds by a woman with a ruthless reputation. But she didn't know that within the hour, this humiliated waiter would be the only person standing between her neglected daughter and absolute tragedy. Larry Fisher's alarm clock didn't buzz. It rattled against the cheap, peeling veneer of his nightstand like a dying insect. It was 5 a.m. in Chicago, and the bitter winter wind was already howling against the thin, frosted glass of his studio apartment window. Larry reached out a calloused hand, slamming the snooze button before the noise could wake the tiny figure huddled under a mountain of blankets across the room. His son, Toby, was only 6 years old, but he carried a heavy asthma diagnosis that turned every winter into a terrifying game of Russian roulette. Larry sat on the edge of his cramped mattress, burying his face in his hands. He took a deep, grounding breath, fighting the crushing wave of exhaustion that had become his constant companion. He was 28, but the deep lines bracketing his eyes made him look 10 years older. Since his wife, Sarah, passed away from a sudden aneurysm 3 years ago, Larry's world had shrunk to a singular, desperate focus, keeping Toby safe, fed, and breathing. Sarah's medical bills had wiped out their meager savings, and the subsequent funeral costs had plunged Larry into a suffocating debt that he was still clawing his way out of. He stood up quietly, his joints popping in the frigid air. The heater in the apartment had broken 3 days ago, and his landlord, a famously ruthless man named Arthur Pendleton, refused to fix it until the rent was paid in full. Larry was exactly $200 short. Moving softly to the kitchenette, Larry prepared a small bowl of oatmeal, carefully measuring out the cheap oats and mixing them with a splash of milk. He set it on the small folding table before gently waking his son. "Hey, buddy. Time to get up," Larry whispered, brushing a lock of brown hair from Toby's pale forehead. Toby stirred, coughing weakly into his fist. The sound sent a spike of pure adrenaline through Larry's heart. He quickly reached for the daily inhaler on the nightstand, pressing it into Toby's small hands. "Take a puff, Toby, nice and slow." After Toby's breathing steadied, Larry bundled him into 2 layers of sweaters and a thick winter coat. He dropped Toby off at Mrs. Higgins' apartment down the hall. The elderly widow watched Toby during the day for a fraction of what a real daycare would cost. A blessing Larry thanked God for every single day. "Be a good boy for Mrs. Higgins, okay? Daddy will bring home those star stickers you like tonight," Larry promised, kneeling to press a kiss to his son's forehead. "Love you, Daddy," Toby mumbled, clutching his worn, stuffed bear. "Love you more, buddy." By 3:30 p.m., Larry was walking through the opulent, gilded service doors of Lumiere, one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in the city. The contrast between his freezing, crumbling apartment and the warm, golden glow of the restaurant's dining room was always jarring. Here, a single appetizer cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Larry hurried to the locker room, stripping off his threadbare winter coat and pulling on the crisp, immaculate white shirt, black vest, and black tie required of the waitstaff. He smoothed down his hair and checked his reflection in the smudged mirror. He looked tired, but he forced a bright, subservient smile onto his face. The floor manager, Richard Croft, a perpetually red-faced man with a cruel streak and a Napoleon complex, was already barking orders in the kitchen. "Fisher, you're late," Richard snapped, tapping a gold watch on his wrist. 3 minutes. That's coming out of your tips." "I apologize, Mr. Croft. The bus was delayed by the snow," Larry said, keeping his voice level and respectful. He couldn't afford to lose his temper. He couldn't afford to lose this job. The tips at Lumiere were the only thing keeping him and Toby off the streets. I don't care if the bus was hijacked by terrorists, Fisher. You are on my time now, Richard sneered, thrusting a leather-bound reservation book into Larry's chest. Table 4, VIPs. And if you screw this up, you'll be washing dishes at a diner in the slums by tomorrow morning. Now move. Larry nodded sharply, gripping the tray in his hands. He took a deep breath, locking away his exhaustion, his fear for Toby, and his own pride. For the next 8 hours, he wasn't Larry Fisher, a desperate father. He was a ghost, a servant, an invisible entity designed only to cater to the whims of the ultra-rich. He walked out into the dining room, unaware that the wealthy patron sitting at table 4 was about to shatter his fragile world into a million pieces. Veronica Garcia did not walk into a room. She conquered it. At 34, she was the undisputed CEO of Garcia Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate that her father had founded, and she had ruthlessly expanded. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, with a flawless, icy blonde bob and eyes the color of flint, Veronica radiated an aura of absolute authority and chilling impatience. Trailing a few steps behind her was her 8-year-old daughter, Charlie. Charlie was small for her age, drowning in a ridiculously expensive navy blue peacoat. While her mother was barking commands into a sleek smartphone, Charlie's wide, observant eyes scanned the sparkling chandeliers and the velvet drapery of Lumiere. She looked entirely out of place, a quiet, lonely shadow caught in the blinding spotlight of her mother's life. I don't care what the board says, David. You tell them that if they block this acquisition, I will personally see to it that they are stripped of their shares by Friday. Veronica snapped into her phone, not even glancing at the maitre d' who bowed deeply as he led them to table 4. She slid into the plush booth, waving a dismissive hand at the menus. Charlie climbed into the seat across from her, her legs swinging nervously. Mommy, Charlie whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the restaurant. Can I get the macaroni? Veronica held up a rigid finger, silencing her daughter without looking at her. David, handle it. I am at dinner with Charlie. Yes, fine. Call me in 20. She ended the call and tossed the phone onto the linen tablecloth, finally sighing and pinching the bridge of her nose. Larry approached the table with professional grace, standing at a polite distance. Good evening, ladies. My name is Larry, and I will be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some sparkling water, or perhaps— Sparkling water. Lemon, no ice, Veronica interrupted sharply, finally looking up. Her gaze swept over Larry, dissecting him in a fraction of a second, and finding him utterly unremarkable. And a bottle of the 98 Chateau Margaux. Bring it immediately. I don't have all night to wait for you to find the cellar. Right away, ma'am, Larry said, maintaining his polite smile, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. He glanced at the little girl, offering a warm, genuine wink. Charlie's eyes widened slightly, and a tiny, hesitant smile touched the corners of her mouth before she looked down at her hands. The dinner service was a nightmare. Veronica spent the next hour alternating between intense, aggressive phone calls and criticizing everything placed in front of her. The soup was too tepid, the salad was overdressed, the lighting was giving her a migraine. Larry absorbed every complaint with practiced apologies, running back and forth to the kitchen while Richard Croft watched him like a hawk waiting for a mouse to stumble. Through it all, Charlie sat in virtual silence. She picked at her buttered noodles, occasionally casting longing glances at the families laughing at other tables. Larry's heart ached for the girl. She reminded him so much of Toby, not in appearance, but in that quiet, desperate need for attention. The disaster struck just after the main courses were cleared. Larry returned to the table carrying a tray holding a fresh pot of coffee, 2 porcelain cups, and Veronica's refilled glass of the expensive Chateau Margaux. As he approached, Veronica was in the middle of a furious argument with one of her executives on speakerphone. If you cannot execute a simple hostile takeover, why am I paying you 7 figures? Veronica shouted, throwing her hands up in exasperation. In her blind frustration, her arm swung backward, colliding violently with the bottom of Larry's tray just as he was lowering it to the table. Physics took over. The tray tipped. Larry desperately tried to correct the balance, his fingers scrambling for a grip, but the momentum was too strong. The heavy crystal wine glass toppled over, sending a tidal wave of dark, crimson wine cascading directly onto Veronica's lap, soaking through the expensive fabric of her trousers and splashing onto her pristine white silk blouse. A collective gasp echoed through the dining room. The nearby tables fell dead silent. Veronica froze. She looked down at the dark red stain spreading across her clothes, and then she slowly, methodically raised her eyes to Larry. The fury in her expression was absolute, a cold, terrifying rage that made the air in the room feel heavy. I am so incredibly sorry, ma'am, Larry stammered, his heart dropping into his stomach. He grabbed a linen napkin, instinctively reaching out to help dab the spill. Please, let me— Do not touch me! Veronica shrieked, slapping his hand away so hard that the napkin flew onto the floor. She stood up, her chair screeching violently against the hardwood. Are you completely incompetent? Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? It costs more than you make in a year, you clumsy, pathetic excuse for a waiter. Ma'am, your arm hit the tray, I tried to catch it. Larry started to explain, panic rising in his chest. Toby's face flashed in his mind. The rent, the inhalers, the groceries. Are you calling me a liar? Veronica's voice echoed off the walls. She turned toward the front of the restaurant, snapping her fingers. Manager! I want the manager here now! Richard Croft practically materialized beside the table, his face pale with terror. Ms. Garcia, I am so deeply sorry. This is entirely unacceptable. This idiot ruined my evening and my wardrobe. Veronica cut him off, pointing a manicured, trembling finger at Larry's chest. I want him fired, immediately. If he is still employed by this establishment in 5 minutes, I will buy this restaurant tomorrow and bulldoze it to the ground. Larry felt the blood drain from his face. Mr. Croft, please. It was an accident. I have a son. I need this job. He turned to Veronica, abandoning his pride. Please, Ms. Garcia, I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I'll do anything. I am a single father. I can't lose this income. Veronica looked at him with a mixture of disgust and absolute apathy. Your personal problems are not my concern. Your incompetence is. You are nothing to me. She looked back at Croft. Well? Croft didn't even hesitate. You're fired, Fisher. Get your things and get out the back door now. Larry stood frozen. He looked at the floor, the ruined napkin, the spilled wine that looked like blood on the white tablecloth. He looked up and met Charlie's eyes. The little girl was shrinking into her seat, looking at him with deep, sorrowful empathy. She knew her mother was wrong. But she was powerless. Without another word, Larry turned and walked toward the kitchen. He felt 100 pairs of wealthy eyes burning into his back, stripping away his dignity, piece by piece. He had just been destroyed over a spilled glass of wine. The alleyway behind Lumiere smelled of rotting garbage and stale grease. The freezing wind whipped through the narrow brick corridor, biting through Larry's thin shirt as he stood shivering near the dumpsters. He held his worn winter coat in his hands, staring blankly at the brick wall opposite him. He had been stripped of his uniform, handed his meager tips from the first half of his shift, and escorted out by a security guard. It was 8:15 p.m. Larry leaned against the freezing brick, sliding down until he was crouching on the wet asphalt. He buried his face in his knees, letting out a ragged, dry sob. He had failed. He had failed Toby. How was he going to pay Mr. Pendleton? How was he going to afford the heating bill? The terror of eviction, of seeing his sick child out on the snowy streets, clamped around his throat like a vice. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered to the empty alley. "I'm so sorry." Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere remained incredibly tense. Veronica, having retreated to the luxury restroom to furiously dab at her stained suit with club soda, had left Charlie sitting alone at the table. "Stay here, Charlie. Do not move," Veronica had commanded before marching off. But Charlie was terrified. The shouting, the spilled wine, the look of profound sadness on the waiter's face. It had all overwhelmed her. She hated it when her mother yelled. She hated the cruel, cold way her mother treated people. Seeking an escape from the staring eyes of the other patrons, Charlie slipped out of her booth. She wandered toward the back of the restaurant, pushing through the heavy velvet curtains that led toward the rear exit, hoping to find a quiet place to hide until her mother calmed down. She pushed open the heavy metal service door, stepping out into the dark, freezing alleyway. The sudden drop in temperature made her gasp. She hugged her coat tightly around her small frame, shivering as she walked a few steps away from the door. At the end of the alley, a massive delivery truck for the restaurant next door was idling loudly, its exhaust pluming into the night air. The driver, exhausted and in a rush to finish his route, had left the vehicle running and out of gear on the slight incline of the alley while he went inside to get a signature. Larry, still crouching by the dumpsters in the shadows, wiped his eyes. He heard the squeak of the metal door and looked up to see the little girl from table 4, Charlie, standing near the center of the alley, looking lost and frightened. He stood up slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," he called out softly. "It's freezing out here. You shouldn't be outside without your mom." Charlie turned, recognizing him. "You're the man," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry my mom yelled at you." Larry managed a small, broken smile. "It's okay, kiddo. It happens. Come on, let's get you back inside before—" A loud, metallic clunk echoed from the top of the alley. Larry's head snapped toward the sound. The heavy delivery truck, vibrating violently from its idling engine, had just slipped its worn parking brake. With no driver in the cab, and parked on a slick, icy downward slope, the massive 10-ton vehicle began to roll backward. It was moving slowly at first, but gravity quickly took hold. The giant dual tires crunched over the icy asphalt, picking up speed, reversing straight down the narrow alleyway, right toward Charlie. The girl turned, freezing in absolute terror like a deer in headlights. The massive metal back door of the truck was bearing down on her, the roaring engine drowning out any other sound. "Move!" Larry screamed, his vocal cords tearing. But Charlie couldn't move. Fear had locked her muscles entirely. She just squeezed her eyes shut and let out a piercing, high-pitched scream. Larry didn't think. The instinct of a father overrode every ounce of logic and self-preservation in his body. He lunged forward, sprinting across the icy pavement with a speed he didn't know he possessed. His shoes slipped, but he caught his balance, throwing his entire body weight forward into the path of the reversing truck. He tackled Charlie around the waist, just as the rear bumper of the truck clipped the space she had occupied a fraction of a second before. The sheer force of his dive sent them both flying sideways toward the brick wall. Larry twisted in midair, ensuring his own body took the brunt of the impact. His shoulder slammed brutally into the rough brick, his head cracking agonizingly against the frozen pavement. The truck continued rolling, smashing violently into the heavy metal dumpsters at the end of the alley, with an ear-splitting crash before grinding to a halt. For a moment, there was only ringing in Larry's ears. The world spun in dizzying circles. Pain flared violently in his shoulder and the back of his head. He groaned, tasting copper in his mouth, but his arms remained locked tightly around the small, trembling form beneath him. Are you okay?" Larry gasped out, his vision blurring as he looked down at Charlie. Charlie opened her eyes. She was unharmed, completely shielded by Larry's body. She looked at the massive truck that had almost crushed her, then up at Larry's bleeding forehead. She burst into terrified tears, burying her face into his chest. Suddenly, the heavy service door flew open. Veronica Garcia ran out into the alley, her face completely drained of color. When she had returned from the restroom to find Charlie missing, panic had finally pierced her icy exterior. A busboy had pointed her toward the back doors. "Charlie!" Veronica screamed, her voice breaking in a way it never had in any boardroom. She rushed over, dropping to her knees in the filthy, freezing snow and grease. She pulled Charlie from Larry's arms, hugging her daughter so tightly she practically crushed her. "Oh my God, Charlie! What happened? What are you doing out here?" Charlie, sobbing uncontrollably, pointed a small, shaking finger at the massive truck embedded in the dumpsters, and then pointed at Larry, who was struggling to sit up, clutching his bleeding head. "The truck! It was going to crush me, Mommy!" Charlie cried, clinging to Veronica's stained coat. "He saved me. He pushed me out of the way. He's my hero." Veronica froze. Her frantic eyes darted from the heavy tires of the delivery truck, tracing the tire tracks on the icy slope, and finally landing on the man bleeding on the pavement. It was the waiter. The man she had humiliated. The man she had fired and thrown out into the cold like trash just 15 minutes ago. He had just risked his own life to save her daughter's. A profound, sickening wave of realization washed over Veronica Garcia. She looked at Larry Fisher, truly looking at him for the first time, and the impenetrable ice around her heart began to crack. Part 4. The Bleeding Pride. The freezing wind howled through the alleyway, but Veronica Garcia felt as though she were standing in the center of a roaring furnace. The sheer terror of almost losing her daughter had stripped away her icy corporate armor in a matter of seconds, leaving her gasping, trembling, and entirely human. She stared at the man bleeding on the icy asphalt. Larry Fisher's breath plumed in the frigid air as he clutched his shoulder, his face pale and contorted in pain. A dark stream of blood was running down his temple from where his head had struck the brick wall. "Mommy, he's hurt," Charlie whimpered, burying her face into Veronica's ruined silk blouse. "We have to help him." Veronica's mind, usually a supercomputer capable of processing hostile takeovers and market fluctuations in milliseconds, stalled completely. This was the man she had just publicly crucified. This was the man she had discarded over a dry cleaning bill, and without a second's hesitation, he had thrown himself in front of 10 tons of moving steel to save her child. I'll call an ambulance," Veronica stammered, frantically reaching into her pocket for her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. "No," Larry gasped, his voice raspy and panicked. He forced himself up onto his knees, swaying dangerously as a wave of severe dizziness washed over him. "No ambulance. Please, don't." Veronica stared at him, bewildered. "You are bleeding from the head, Mr. Fisher. You could have a severe concussion or internal bleeding. You need a hospital immediately." "Do you have any idea what a 5-mile ride in an ambulance costs?" Larry choked out, gripping the icy brick wall to pull himself to his feet. "It costs $2,000. I don't have $2,000. I don't even have $200. The words hit Veronica like a physical blow. The stark, desperate reality of his life clashed violently with her own. She had just authorized a $50 million acquisition over an appetizer, and this bleeding hero in front of her was terrified of a medical bill. Before she could respond, the heavy metal door of the restaurant burst open again. Richard Croft, the floor manager, rushed out, followed by a frantic security guard. "Ms. Garcia, oh, thank heavens you found her," Croft panted, his eyes darting from Veronica to the smashed delivery truck. Then his gaze landed on Larry. His expression immediately soured. "Fisher, what the hell are you still doing here? I told you to leave the premises immediately." Veronica's head snapped toward Croft. The sheer venom in her eyes made the manager take an involuntary step backward. "He saved my daughter's life, you insufferable idiot!" Veronica hissed, her voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper. That truck rolled down the alley. He pushed Charlie out of the way and took the impact. Croft paled, his mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish. I had no idea, ma'am. I just assumed since he was fired." "He was fired because I threw a temper tantrum like a spoiled child!" Veronica practically screamed, the guilt finally boiling over into pure rage. She stood up, shielding Charlie behind her legs. "You didn't even investigate. You just threw him out into the freezing cold because you were afraid of me." But Ms. Garcia, you demanded his termination," Croft stammered, terrified for his own job now. "And you should have had the spine to defend your employee," Veronica snapped. She turned her back on the sputtering manager, pulling her expensive cashmere scarf from her neck. She stepped toward Larry, her hands trembling as she pressed the soft fabric against the bleeding gash on his forehead. Larry flinched, instinctively pulling away, his pride battling his physical weakness. "I'm fine. I just need to go home. I need to get to my son." "Your son?" Veronica asked softly, her eyes searching his pale face. "Toby," Larry whispered, his legs buckling slightly. "He's 6. He has severe asthma. I have to go pick him up from the neighbors before she goes to sleep. I can't be late." He took a step toward the street, but his knees gave out entirely. Before he could hit the pavement, Veronica caught him by the shoulders. She was surprisingly strong, bearing his weight as he slumped against her. The blood from his forehead soaked into her cashmere scarf, mixing with the spilled wine that had initiated this entire nightmare. "Graham!" Veronica screamed into her phone, having dialed her private driver on speed dial. "Bring the SUV to the alley behind the restaurant right now. Move!" Less than 30 seconds later, a sleek black Cadillac Escalade screeched into the alleyway, its heavy tires crunching over the ice. A tall, broad-shouldered driver leapt out, rushing around to open the rear doors. "Let me get him in," Veronica commanded, struggling under Larry's dead weight. "Ms. Garcia, I shouldn't. My coat is dirty. I'll ruin the leather," Larry mumbled deliriously, still trying to push away. "Shut up about the leather, Mr. Fisher," Veronica said, her voice fierce but laced with an uncharacteristic tenderness. "Get in the car. Give Graham your address. We are taking you to your son." The ride to the south side of Chicago took less than 20 minutes, but to Veronica, it felt like an eternity. The heated leather seats of the Escalade offered a stark contrast to the freezing winds howling outside, but the warmth couldn't penetrate the heavy silence inside the vehicle. Charlie sat as close to Larry as the seatbelts would allow, her small hand resting gently on the sleeve of his worn winter coat. Larry was slipping in and out of full consciousness, holding Veronica's blood-soaked cashmere scarf to his temple. He kept muttering Toby's name, his anxiety radiating off him in palpable waves. When Graham finally pulled the massive luxury SUV to a stop, Veronica looked out the tinted window and felt her stomach drop. Larry lived in a crumbling brick tenement building that looked as though it had been abandoned a decade ago. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long, menacing shadows across the graffiti-covered walls. Trash was piled high near the overflowing dumpsters, and the front door of the building hung off its hinges, offering zero protection from the bitter winter air. "Mr. Fisher, you can't possibly live here," Veronica whispered, her privileged reality fracturing entirely. "Apartment 4B, Larry grunted, forcing the door open before Graham could assist him. He stumbled out onto the cracked sidewalk, the freezing air jolting him awake. Veronica didn't hesitate. She grabbed Charlie's hand and followed him into the darkened, foul-smelling stairwell. The scent of boiled cabbage, bleach, and damp rot permeated the air. The heating in the building was clearly non-existent. It was almost as cold inside as it was out on the street. Larry dragged himself up 4 flights of stairs, his breathing ragged. He stopped in front of a peeling wooden door marked 4A and knocked frantically. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman wrapped in 3 thick cardigans. Mrs. Higgins looked at Larry's bloodied face and gasped. "Oh, Lord Almighty, Larry, what on earth happened to you?" "I had a fall, Mrs. Higgins. I'm okay," Larry lied, his voice strained. "Where's Toby? Is he breathing all right? Did he need his inhaler?" Before the elderly woman could answer, a small figure rushed out from behind her legs. Toby, wrapped in a faded fleece blanket, threw his arms around Larry's legs. "Daddy!" the boy cried, before descending into a harsh, rattling cough that echoed violently in the narrow hallway. Larry instantly dropped to his knees, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. He pulled Toby into his chest, rubbing the boy's back as the coughing fit subsided. "I'm here, buddy. Daddy's here. I'm so sorry I'm late." Veronica stood in the shadows of the hallway, holding Charlie's hand tightly. She watched the young father holding his sick child, realizing that the money she had spent on her ruined blouse could have likely moved this family out of this freezing slum for a year. "He's been coughing for the last hour, Larry," Mrs. Higgins whispered sympathetically. "The cold is seeping right through the walls. Did Mr. Pendleton fix your heater yet?" Larry squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. "No, he won't send maintenance until I pay the back rent." Veronica stepped out of the shadows, her presence instantly demanding attention in the cramped, dim hallway. Mrs. Higgins took a startled step back, intimidated by the woman's sharp suit and commanding aura. "We are going inside your apartment, Mr. Fisher." "Now," Veronica stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Larry was too exhausted to fight. He scooped Toby up into his arms, unlocking the door to 4B across the hall. When he flipped the light switch, Veronica's breath caught in her throat. The apartment was no larger than her walk-in closet at home. It consisted of a single room, with a mattress pushed into the corner, a tiny kitchenette, and a folding card table. The walls were entirely bare, save for a few of Toby's crayon drawings taped near the bed. The air inside was bone-chillingly cold. Every breath they took materialized into white mist. Nailed ruthlessly to the center of the wooden door was a bright pink piece of paper. "Final eviction notice. Signed, Arthur Pendleton, Property Management." Veronica walked over to the notice, reading the bold black letters. The amount owed was $800. $800 was standing between this heroic man, his sick child, and the freezing streets of Chicago. "I'm sorry for the mess," Larry muttered awkwardly, setting Toby down on the mattress and pulling every blanket he owned over the shivering boy. "I wasn't expecting company." Charlie walked over to the mattress, cautiously pulling a small, untouched chocolate bar from her coat pocket, a leftover from her untouched dessert at the restaurant. She held it out to Toby. "Hi, I'm Charlie. Your dad is a superhero." Toby peeked out from the blankets, his eyes wide as he accepted the chocolate. "He is?" "Yeah, he saved my life," Charlie said softly. Veronica turned away from the eviction notice, her heart pounding with a strange, fierce rhythm. She looked at Larry, who was leaning against the kitchen counter, looking completely defeated, waiting for the inevitable collapse of his world. She had spent her entire life tearing people down to build her empire. She had fired him without a second thought because he was an inconvenience. But looking around this freezing, desolate room, looking at the blood drying on his forehead and the fierce love in his eyes when he looked at his son, Veronica Garcia realized she didn't want to destroy anymore. She pulled her sleek smartphone from her pocket, the screen glowing brightly in the dim apartment. She didn't call her board of directors, She didn't call her stockbroker. She dialed her private bank. "Mr. Fisher," Veronica said, her voice dropping its icy edge, replaced by a warm, unshakable determination. "Pack whatever you and Toby need for the next few days. You are not staying in this freezer tonight." Larry blinked, gripping the counter. "Ms. Garcia, please. I don't want your charity. I appreciate the ride, but we are fine here." "This is not charity, Larry," Veronica replied, using his first name for the first time. She walked across the small room, stopping inches from him. She looked up into his tired, desperate eyes. "This is a debt. You saved my daughter. You saved my entire world. And I am going to spend every ounce of my power making sure yours never falls apart again." The private elevator doors glided open with a soft, melodic chime, revealing a world that Larry Fisher had only ever seen in magazines left behind on subway seats. Veronica Garcia's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper overlooking Lake Michigan. It was a sprawling expanse of white marble, floor-to-ceiling windows, and plush, modern furnishings bathed in the warm, ambient glow of recessed lighting. To Larry, stepping out of the elevator felt like crossing into a different dimension. The ambient temperature was a perfect, deeply comforting 72 degrees. The air smelled faintly of cedar and expensive vanilla, a staggering contrast to the mold and boiled cabbage of his tenement building. Graham, the massive driver, carried a sleeping Toby wrapped in his faded fleece blanket, moving with surprising gentleness. Larry trailed behind, his hand instinctively clutching the bloodied cashmere scarf to his temple. He felt intensely aware of his dirty, scuffed shoes on the pristine white rugs and the smell of alleyway grease clinging to his uniform. "Graham, take Toby to the guest wing, the blue suite," Veronica instructed, her heels clicking softly against the marble. She turned to a sleek intercom on the wall. "Maria, please wake up. I need a hot meal prepared, something gentle for a child's stomach. And call Dr. Hayes. Tell him I need a house call immediately. It's an emergency." Larry stood frozen in the foyer, his pride warring with his profound exhaustion. "Ms. Garcia, this is too much. You really didn't have to—" "Stop calling me Ms. Garcia!" Veronica interrupted, turning to face him. Without her sharp blazer, her ruined silk blouse stained with wine, she looked unexpectedly vulnerable. "My name is Veronica, and please, Larry, just let me do this. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for Toby. He needs a warm bed tonight." The mention of his son drained the last of Larry's resistance. He nodded slowly, swaying on his feet as a fresh wave of dizziness hit him. Before he could collapse, Veronica was at his side, her arm firmly gripping his uninjured shoulder. She guided him into a massive living room, easing him down onto a sprawling, slate-gray velvet sofa. "Sit, don't move," she commanded gently. Within 20 minutes, the penthouse was humming with quiet, efficient activity. Maria, a warm, middle-aged housekeeper, brought out a tray of hot chamomile tea, freshly baked bread, and a bowl of rich chicken broth. Charlie, having changed into warm pajamas, sat cross-legged on the floor near the sofa, quietly drawing on a sketch pad, keeping a watchful, protective eye on Larry. Then, Dr. Hayes arrived. He was a discreet, silver-haired concierge physician accustomed to the midnight emergencies of the ultra-rich. He immediately went to work, stitching the deep gash on Larry's forehead and checking his shoulder. "Mild concussion and a badly bruised rotator cuff, Mr. Fisher," Dr. Hayes murmured, packing away his medical bag. "You took a hell of a hit. I'll leave some pain medication. You need rest, absolutely no heavy lifting, and someone to monitor you for the next 24 hours. "And the boy?" Veronica asked, standing near the doorway with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I examined Toby in the guest room. His oxygen levels were lower than I'd like, likely due to prolonged exposure to severe cold. I've administered a nebulizer treatment and prescribed a stronger daily preventative inhaler. He's sleeping soundly now, but keeping him in a warm, dry environment is paramount. Dr. Hayes adjusted his glasses, looking from Larry to Veronica. Whatever you're paying for heating in your current residence, Mr. Fisher, I suggest you withhold it. It's a health hazard. Larry let out a bitter, breathy laugh. I wish it were that simple, Doc. After the doctor departed, Veronica walked over and sat on the opposite end of the velvet sofa. The city lights of Chicago glittered outside the massive windows, a sea of diamonds against the black night. For a long time, the only sound was the scratching of Charlie's crayons. My father built Garcia Enterprises from nothing, Veronica said suddenly, her voice quiet, almost reflective. He was ruthless. He taught me that empathy was a corporate liability, that if you show weakness, people will bleed you dry. I've lived my entire life believing that everyone has a price and everyone is out for themselves. She looked at Larry, her flint-colored eyes searching his bruised face. When I spilled that wine on myself tonight, my first instinct was to destroy the person closest to the embarrassment. It was a reflex. I didn't see a human being, Larry. I saw a target. I'm used to it, Larry said softly, staring down at his hands. When you wear the uniform, you're not a person to most people. You're just part of the furniture. But you saw my daughter, Veronica whispered, her voice cracking slightly. She glanced at Charlie, who had fallen asleep on the plush rug, her head resting on a throw pillow. You were fired, humiliated, and terrified for your son's future. You had every reason to walk away and hate me. But you threw yourself in front of a truck for my little girl. Veronica leaned forward, her intense gaze locking onto his. You proved my entire worldview wrong in a fraction of a second. You don't have a price, Larry. You have honor. And because of that, I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. But I am going to try. Veronica, you gave us a warm place to sleep tonight. That's more than enough. No, Veronica cut him off, a familiar, dangerous spark igniting in her eyes. It was the look of a CO about to go to war. That is barely the beginning. I saw that eviction notice on your door. I know who Arthur Pendleton is. He's a bottom-feeding slumlord who preys on desperate families. Tomorrow, you are going to rest. I am going to work. The next morning, Larry woke up to the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee. For a terrifying second, he forgot where he was. The mattress was incredibly soft, the sheets feeling like spun silk against his skin. Sunlight streamed through a gap in the heavy blackout curtains. He sat up, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through his bruised shoulder, and his stitched forehead throbbed. Memories of the alleyway, the runaway truck, and the freezing tenement flooded back. He threw off the covers and hurried out of the guest room, panic rising in his chest. Toby. He found his son in the sprawling, sunlit kitchen. Toby was sitting at a massive marble island, his face smeared with maple syrup, happily demolishing a stack of pancakes. Charlie sat next to him, showing him how to play a game on a sleek tablet. The boy's breathing was clear, completely free of the rattling wheeze that had haunted Larry for weeks. "Morning, sleepyhead," Veronica said, walking into the kitchen. She was back in her armor, a razor-sharp, navy blue tailored suit, her blonde hair flawlessly styled. She held a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other. "How is he?" Larry asked, rushing to Toby and pressing a hand to the boy's forehead. "Normal temperature." "He's perfect," Veronica smiled, gesturing for Maria to fix Larry a plate. "Eat, Larry. You need your strength, because we have a very busy morning ahead of us." As Larry forced himself to eat, Veronica sat across from him at the kitchen island, her fingers flying across her tablet. "My legal team has been awake since 4 a.m., she announced casually, taking a sip of coffee. "I had them look into Arthur Pendleton's property management company." Larry stopped chewing, a knot forming in his stomach. "Veronica, Pendleton is a dangerous guy. He has connections. If he finds out I complained to someone rich, he'll lock me out of my apartment and throw all my things in a dumpster." Veronica's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a cold, terrifying expression. "Oh, I'm counting on it." Right on cue, Larry's cheap prepaid cell phone, resting on the counter, buzzed violently. The caller ID flashed, "Mrs. Higgins." Larry grabbed it. "Mrs. Higgins, is everything okay?" "Larry, honey, it's terrible." The elderly woman's voice panicked through the tiny speaker. "Mr. Pendleton is here with 2 big men. They broke the lock on your door. They're throwing all your things into the hallway in garbage bags. They said since you didn't pay the $800, you're out." Larry's blood ran cold. The few photographs of Sarah, Toby's winter clothes, the meager belongings they had left. It was all being tossed away like trash. "I'm coming right now," Larry said, his voice shaking with helpless rage. He hung up and stood, swaying slightly. "I have to go. Pendleton is illegally evicting me right now. He's throwing my life on the street." Veronica stood up, completely unbothered. She checked the gold Rolex on her wrist. "Perfect timing. Graham is waiting downstairs with the car. Let's go see Mr. Pendleton." 20 minutes later, the black Escalade pulled up to the crumbling tenement building on the south side. Larry jumped out before the car even fully stopped, ignoring the pain in his head. Veronica followed closely behind, flanked by Graham and another man in a sharp suit carrying a leather briefcase, one of Garcia Enterprises' top corporate litigators. They marched up the dark, foul-smelling stairwell. When they reached the 4th floor, the hallway was a disaster zone. Black trash bags were ripped open, spilling Larry's clothes and Toby's toys across the dirty linoleum. Standing in the middle of the mess was Arthur Pendleton, a heavy-set man with a greasy comb-over and a cheap cigar clamped between his teeth. He was barking orders at 2 massive, tattooed men who were dragging Larry's mattress out of the apartment. "Hey!" Larry shouted, stepping forward. "What the hell are you doing? You have to give 30 days' notice for an eviction." Pendleton sneered, blowing a cloud of foul smoke into the hallway. "Well, look who decided to show up. The rules are whatever I say they are, Fisher. You didn't pay the rent. Your garbage goes to the dump and you go to the shelter. Now get out of my building before I have my boys toss you down the stairs." "That is a fascinating perspective on property law, Mr. Pendleton." A cold, authoritative voice echoed through the hallway. Pendleton blinked, looking past Larry to see Veronica Garcia stepping into the dim light. She looked entirely out of place in the slum, radiating an aura of untouchable wealth and power. "Who the hell are you?" Pendleton scoffed. "His new girlfriend? Look, lady, this is private property. Beat it!" Veronica didn't flinch. She gestured to the lawyer beside her. "Mr. Davies, would you care to educate our friend here?" The lawyer opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of freshly printed, notarized documents. Arthur Pendleton. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Garcia Enterprises has successfully executed a hostile buyout of Apex Property Management's holding company. Pendleton's cigar fell from his mouth, bouncing off his protruding stomach and landing on the floor. "What? That's impossible. You can't just buy a company in 3 hours?" "When you have $5 billion in liquid assets and an army of corporate sharks, you can buy almost anything, Arthur," Veronica said, stepping closer, her heels clicking ominously on the cheap floor. "You see, I did a deep dive into your finances. You were heavily leveraged. A few well-placed calls to your creditors, a massive cash offer to your parent company, and they sold you out before you even had your morning coffee." She picked up one of Toby's stuffed animals from the dirty floor, dusting it off with her immaculate sleeve before fixing Pendleton with a stare that could freeze boiling water. "You don't own this building anymore, Arthur. I do," Veronica stated, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You don't own any of your buildings. You are currently trespassing on Garcia property. Furthermore, my legal team has compiled a dossier of your illegal lockouts, code violations, and extortion tactics over the last 10 years. The state attorney is a close, personal friend of mine, and he is very excited to see it." Pendleton turned pale, sweat instantly beading on his greasy forehead. The 2 large men behind him nervously dropped the mattress and backed away, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in power. "Now," Veronica commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the mess in the hallway. "You are going to pick up every single item you threw out of my friend's apartment. You are going to fold it, clean it, and place it gently back inside. Then you are going to apologize to Mr. Fisher." Pendleton swallowed hard, his bravado entirely shattered. And if I don't? Then I will bury you under so much litigation that your grandchildren will be paying off your legal fees." Veronica smiled thinly. "Start picking up the toys, Arthur." Larry stood in stunned silence as he watched his cruel, tyrannical landlord drop to his knees in the dirty hallway and begin frantically picking up scattered crayons and faded sweaters. Veronica turned back to Larry, her icy demeanor melting into a warm, genuine smile. "Well, that's one problem solved. Now, I believe we have an unfinished reservation at Lumiere to attend to. Someone owes you a massive apology for spilling wine on my coat." The golden chandeliers of Lumiere cast a warm, opulent glow over the pristine white tablecloths. It was 3 p.m., the quiet lull before the dinner rush, and the staff was frantically preparing for the evening service. In the center of the main dining room, Richard Croft, the floor manager, was red-faced and shouting, berating a young busboy for a microscopic smudge on a crystal water glass. "Do you think this is a diner in a bowling alley, Kevin?" Croft barked, his voice echoing off the velvet-lined walls. "If you cannot polish a glass, you are useless to me. I fired a veteran waiter yesterday for less. Do you want to join Fisher on the bread line?" "Actually, Richard, Mr. Fisher has moved on to far more lucrative ventures." The icy, perfectly modulated voice sliced through the dining room like a well-honed scalpel. Croft froze, his face draining of color. He spun around, his polished shoes squeaking on the hardwood floor. Walking through the grand oak double doors of the restaurant was Veronica Garcia. She was flanked by her corporate lawyer and, to Croft's absolute horror, Larry Fisher. Larry was no longer wearing the threadbare winter coat or the subservient, exhausted expression he had carried for years. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that Veronica had insisted her tailor fit him for that morning, Larry looked striking, confident, and completely out of Croft's league. The neatly bandaged cut on his forehead only added to his commanding presence. "Ms. Garcia," Croft stammered, his tyrannical demeanor instantly evaporating into a sickening display of subservience. He practically sprinted across the room, bowing slightly. "What a profound honor. If we had known you were returning, we would have prepared the VIP suite. But, forgive me, why is he with you? This man is terminated. He is a security risk." "The only security risk in this building, Richard, is your staggering incompetence," Veronica said softly, stopping a few feet from the manager. She didn't raise her voice, but the entire restaurant staff had stopped breathing, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "I don't understand, ma'am," Croft whimpered, his eyes darting nervously to Larry, who stood perfectly still, watching the manager with quiet dignity. "He spilled wine on you. You demanded his termination. I was merely executing your orders to maintain the impeccable standards of Lumiere. My orders were given in a moment of blind, arrogant rage," Veronica replied, taking a slow, intimidating step forward. But a true manager, a man who actually leads his staff, would have defended his employee. He would have investigated the incident. But you didn't. You threw a desperate, hard-working father out into a freezing alleyway, and when he was severely injured saving my daughter's life from a runaway truck, you left him bleeding on the asphalt and told him to get off the property. A collective gasp swept through the listening waitstaff. Several of Larry's former colleagues stared at him with newfound profound respect. Croft began to sweat profusely, his collar suddenly looking far too tight. "Ms. Garcia, I swear to you, I didn't know about the truck. I didn't see it. I am terribly sorry if he was hurt, but I assure you, my dedication is to this restaurant and to patrons like yourself." Veronica offered a smile that contained zero warmth. "Yes, well, about this restaurant. Do you remember what I told you last night, Richard, right before I demanded Larry be fired? Croft swallowed hard, his mind racing. You said you would buy the restaurant and bulldoze it to the ground. Exactly, Veronica nodded, snapping her fingers. Mr. Davies, her lawyer, stepped forward, producing a sleek leather folder and handing it to Croft. The manager took it with trembling hands, opening it to reveal a binding transfer of ownership agreement. I didn't bulldoze it, Veronica clarified, her voice ringing with absolute finality, because the architecture is quite stunning. But at 1:00 p.m. today, Garcia Enterprises purchased the entire Lumiere Hospitality Group from the parent company. I own the building, the brand, the menus, and every crystal glass in this room. Croft's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The paper in his hands shook violently. You bought the entire restaurant? I did, Veronica whispered, which makes me your employer. And I am afraid your standards simply do not align with my vision for this company. You are a cruel, cowardly little man who abuses his power to mask his own inadequacies. Please, Ms. Garcia, Croft begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. He looked at Larry, desperation overriding his pride. Fisher, Larry, please, tell her. I was just doing my job. You know how this industry is. I have a mortgage. Larry looked at the man who had tormented him for 3 years, the man who had gleefully deducted tips for being a minute late, the man who had almost cost him his son's home. Larry felt no rage, only a profound sense of pity. You didn't care about my rent yesterday, Richard, Larry said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. You didn't care that I had a sick kid at home. You only care about the rules when they protect you. Veronica turned back to Croft. You have exactly 3 minutes to clear out your locker, Richard. If you are still on my property in 4 minutes, I will have you arrested for trespassing. And trust me, with the severance package you are not receiving, you won't be able to afford bail. Croft opened his mouth to argue, but the terrifying finality in Veronica's eyes silenced him. Defeated, utterly humiliated in front of the staff he had terrorized for years, he turned and slinked away toward the kitchen, his shoulders slumped in ruin. As soon as Croft disappeared, the dining room erupted into spontaneous applause. The busboys, the waitstaff, and even the head chef emerged from the kitchen, clapping and cheering for Larry. Larry felt a blush creep up his neck, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fate. He turned to Veronica, his eyes shining with profound gratitude. You didn't have to buy a multi-million-dollar restaurant just to get my job back, Veronica. Oh, I didn't buy it to get your job back as a waiter, Larry, Veronica smirked, turning to face him fully. I bought it because I needed a new executive director for my hospitality division, and I believe I just found the perfect man for the job. The shock on Larry's face was comical. The applause around them died down as the staff realized a massive corporate restructuring was happening right in the middle of the dining room. Executive director? Larry echoed, staring at Veronica as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. Veronica, I carry trays. I memorize wine lists. I don't run corporate divisions. Don't lie to me, Larry. I had my team do a full background check on you this morning, Veronica said, her tone softening, shedding the ruthless CEO persona and speaking directly to the man who had saved her world. Before your wife, Sarah, was diagnosed, you were halfway through a master's degree in business administration at Northwestern University. You graduated top of your class in your undergraduate hospitality program. You had a brilliant future, and you sacrificed all of it, your career, your education, your savings, to care for your wife and your son. Larry looked down, a wave of old, buried grief washing over him, instantly replaced by a fierce, protective pride. They were my family. There wasn't a choice to make. I'd do it 1,000 times over. I know, Veronica said gently, stepping closer. That is exactly why I want you running this division. I have a company filled with sharks, Larry. I have executives who would sell their own grandmothers for a 2% bump in stock options. What I don't have is someone with absolute, unbreakable integrity. Someone who understands what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to treat the people at the bottom with the same respect as the people at the top. She gestured around the grand restaurant. I want to restructure my entire hospitality portfolio. Better wages, health care for the wait staff, childcare assistance. I want to build a system that supports fathers like you instead of grinding them into dust. But I can't do it alone. I don't know how. I need you to show me. Larry was speechless. The crushing weight of poverty, the constant suffocating fear that had defined his life for the past 3 years, was evaporating in the warm light of this gilded room. He wasn't just being given a handout. He was being given his dignity back. He was being given a chance to use his mind, to build a future for Toby that didn't involve shivering in a dark tenement. He looked at Veronica. He saw past the billions, past the designer suits and the intimidating reputation. He saw the terrified mother in the alleyway, the woman who had held a bloody cashmere scarf to his head and carried his sleeping son into her home. It's going to be a lot of work, Larry said slowly, a small, genuine smile breaking across his face. And I'm going to demand a comprehensive health insurance plan for the entire staff by Q3. Veronica's eyes sparkled with a fierce, joyful light. Is that a negotiation tactic, Mr. Fisher? Because I am incredibly ruthless at the bargaining table. I faced down a runaway 10-ton truck, Veronica. Larry chuckled softly. I think I can handle a billionaire. 6 months later, the chilling winds of Chicago winter had given way to a bright, blooming spring. The penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan was filled with the chaotic, joyful sounds of children laughing. Toby, whose asthma was now meticulously managed by top specialists and a clean, warm environment, was chasing Charlie around the sprawling marble living room, both of them armed with brightly colored foam swords. Larry stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a crisp, casual button-down shirt. He took a sip of his coffee, looking out over the glittering waters of the lake. He was officially the VP of Garcia Hospitality, and in just half a year, he had revolutionized the company's labor practices, boosting employee retention by 80% and turning record profits simply by treating the staff like human beings. A pair of soft, elegant arms wrapped around his waist from behind. The scent of expensive vanilla and cedar drifted over him. Veronica rested her chin against his shoulder, looking out at the same view. She wore a simple white sundress, her hair falling in loose waves, entirely relaxed and radiant. The icy, untouchable CEO was gone, replaced by a woman who had finally learned how to trust, how to feel, and how to love. They're going to break a vase, Veronica murmured, a smile in her voice as a foam sword whacked against a sofa cushion behind them. Let them, Larry replied, turning in her arms and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. We can afford it. Veronica laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that Larry had come to realize was his absolute favorite noise in the world. She looked up into his eyes, the deep affection between them anchoring both of their lives. You saved us, you know, Veronica whispered, reaching up to gently trace the faint silver scar on his temple. Not just in the alley. You saved me from who I was becoming. Larry smiled, pulling her closer as the sun bathed them in its golden warmth. We saved each other, Veronica. That's what partners do. He had started as an invisible ghost, a single father crushed under the heel of an unfeeling world. But in the end, it wasn't a billionaire's wealth that had saved the day. It was the quiet, bleeding courage of a waiter in an alleyway, a hero who had sacrificed everything only to gain the entire world in return. What happens when absolute arrogance collides with humble sacrifice? Will Veronica Garcia's immense wealth be enough to repay the man whose life she ruined right before he saved her daughter? Will Larry's desperate situation finally turn around? Or will the crushing weight of his debts destroy him before the billionaire can make amends? Thank you so much for reading or listening to this incredible story of redemption, sacrifice, and the unexpected twists of fate. If you want to find out what happens next in this emotional journey, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for the upcoming parts. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.